There are evenings when the world feels thinner than parchment, when the air itself seems written over with corrections, erasures, and the weary edits of ages, and tonight is one of those evenings. The flame beside me is no more than a trembling tear of light, clinging to a wick that has outlived its pride, and yet it is enough to draw a small circle of honesty around this table, these pages, and my tired hands. I have spent long years among shelves and dust and brittle bindings, and I should know by now the difference between a pattern and my own imagination, between a prophecy and a coincidence that refuses to die. And still I find myself hesitating at the edge of this confession as though it were a cliff. If you are here with me, listening from your room, your bus seat, your kitchen, wherever you have chosen to let this voice enter, I welcome you as a fellow wanderer, and I ask a small favor in return. Stay with me. Subscribe to this path of questions. Leave your trace in the form of a word, a comment, a sign that I am not the only one trying to read what the world no longer wants to remember. If this story unsettles you, if at any point something inside you whispers that you have seen what I am describing but never had language for it, then let your agreement be known with a quiet mark, a like, a gesture in the direction of this fragile flame. I am only one man, and there are nights when I am not sure if I am discovering a pattern or slowly losing my mind, and the knowledge that someone else is awake with me matters more than I can admit. I should begin where the unease first took root, because it did not start with angels or omens or blood written in the margins of some forbidden scroll. It began with a word, an old word that every faith and language seemed to cradle in some form, a word that always hovered near blessings and farewells and the quiet signing of treaties. The word we use when we imagine an end to war and hatred and the endless grinding of teeth. It is a word so ordinary that we forget how sacred it really is. A word spoken over sleeping children, carved on memorial stones, whispered in hospital corridors. For a long time I thought of it as nothing more than that, an indispensable part of human speech, unable to imagine that such a thing could be tampered with. Only later did I realize that this simple word had become the center of a slow, deliberate erasure. I will name it openly soon, but for a moment I ask you to feel it rather than hear it, to remember the weight of it on your own tongue, the way it has appeared under your fingertips in messages and letters, the way you have perhaps prayed for it, even if you no longer consider yourself religious. Hold it quietly while I speak. My work, if one can call it that, has always moved along the border between scripture and shadow. Libraries, archives, digital repositories, sealed collections that require signatures and silence. European monasteries where bells still mark the hours even as tourists drift through with cameras held high. American seminaries where the walls remember arguments about doctrine that would burn a lesser building to the ground. I came as a researcher at first, a lover of languages and the way they carry memory across centuries. I specialized in blessings, of all things, in the formulas of goodwill and protection that appear at the beginning and end of letters, in liturgies and royal decrees, in diaries and private confessions. It was a safe corner of scholarship, obscure enough that no one bothered to challenge my conclusions. At least that is what I believed. Some years ago, though I would now rather measure time in wounds than in calendars, I began to notice something that should have been impossible. In older texts, especially those copied by hand, the word for that final state of wholeness, that deep quiet between enemies, appeared with a certain reverence. Scribes would trace it more carefully, sometimes adorning the first letter, sometimes leaving a small extra space before and after, as though it were itself a tiny sanctuary on the page. In medieval margins you find small prayers built around it, pleas for a village, a family, a soul. Yet, as the centuries moved forward, something shifted. The word did not disappear all at once. It would have been too obvious. Instead, it began to thin out, replaced in certain contexts by more technical terms: security, order, stability. It was as though a soft human word had slowly been herded into bureaucratic pens, stripped of its warmth. At first, I treated this as a mere cultural trend, the kind that scholars are paid to explain in dry articles. Societies grow cynical, I told myself. They replace the language of blessing with the language of contracts. That is all. It had nothing to do with prophecy, nothing to do with any hidden power bending the tongue of humanity away from a dangerous syllable. So I wrote my articles, presented them at conferences where the coffee tasted of burnt paper, took polite questions from colleagues who found my work charmingly niche. But late at night, when the world quieted and I sat alone like I do now, the pattern kept nagging at me, because it was not merely that the old word became less frequent. In more recent editions of certain texts, I saw something far stranger. Imagine a letter from a century ago, preserved in a family archive, written by a soldier to his wife, promising that he dreams of a day when he can return to her in that longed-for wholeness, that state where guns are silent and neighbors can sleep without flinching. The original letter contains the word, written plainly. But when that letter is reproduced in a modern anthology, the editor replaces it, almost casually, with something flatter, something like tranquility or normal life or political stability. The meaning is similar, but the tone is not. It is as if a candle had been replaced by a fluorescent tube, and this happened not once, but again and again across languages and continents, in religious and secular texts alike. The old word was present in the original, absent in the modern representation. Edited out, standardized away, perhaps unconsciously, perhaps not. This was troubling but not yet supernatural. Editors make choices, trends flow through academia and publishing. I knew all the legitimate explanations. I reminded myself of them often, like a man reciting a creed against his own creeping dread. Yet then I found the first marginal note that changed everything. It was in a monastic codex from a mountain region where snow still buries entire roads each winter. On one page, an older scribe had written the word, "The one I am still making you hold in silence." A later hand had scratched it out so forcefully that the parchment tore, and beside the tear, in cramped, anxious script, someone had added a comment in Latin that I can only translate as this: "Do not write this name. It is no longer ours to use." No longer ours to use. If I were a sensible man, I would have closed the codex at that point, returned it to its drawer, and written a careful note about superstitious scribes and the ways in which religious fear can warp language. I would have turned my attention to something safer, perhaps the evolution of punctuation in devotional texts. But I am not, it seems, a sensible man. I requested access to related manuscripts, traced the handwriting across volumes, followed the faint trail of whoever wrote that warning. The same hand appears in a collection of sermons, where the preacher rails not against heresy or immorality, but against what he calls the reckless invocation of the word that used to hold back war. He speaks of a decree from somewhere he never names, a decision that humanity no longer deserves to speak that word unguarded. By now you may already feel a certain resonance, an uneasy stirring at the edge of your own memory. Think about the last time you heard someone use that word sincerely, not as a slogan, not as a soundbite, but as a deep request, a blessing offered with tears or with the trembling dignity of someone who has seen too much violence. Think about how much more common it has become to speak, instead of victory, security, deterrence, dominance, of all the things that stand on top of others rather than alongside them. My research began to suggest that this was no mere cultural drift. It looked increasingly like compliance with a contract that very few living humans remember signing. I hesitate even now to call what I have read a prophecy, because that word is heavy and often misused. I prefer to say that I stumbled on a pattern that stretches across centuries, preserved in the most fragile and hidden places. Margins, footnotes, overwritten lines, visible only under certain lights. In these half-erased testimonies, I kept seeing the same idea, expressed in various languages and metaphors. They spoke of an agreement made in the unseen realms, some Covenant between the Creator, if you still dare to use that term, and other powers that hover like vultures over human hatred. In that agreement, so the texts insist, there is a clause. As long as human beings keep the true word for that final stillness alive on their tongues and in their writing, something old and merciful remains binding over the earth. However, if a day comes when the word is forgotten, not only unspoken but unwritten in any serious context, then the restraint is lifted. The world becomes legally open territory. You can see why I have lost sleep. You can also see why I resist believing it. I am a man of archives, not visions. My training is in philology and history, not in interpreting apocalyptic whispers. And yet the more I tried to dismiss this as obsessive pattern-seeking, the more stubborn the evidence became. It hid in librarians' notes and in the private diaries of monks who never rose to prominence, in the unpublished drafts of theologians who died before earning their chairs. They all describe, in different images, a time they sensed approaching when the word would no longer fit the world that uttered it. A time when people would feel embarrassed to ask for that kind of wholeness, considering it childish or unrealistic. There were days when I shut the folders, powered down the screen, stepped outside in the hope that fresh air would clear my head. Cities are loud, full of sirens and small anxious gestures, but walk long enough and you will find a park bench, a patch of sky. I would sit and watch strangers hurry past, ears filled with music or news, eyes clouded with private burdens, and I would ask myself whether I was seeing any sign of what those manuscripts described. It is easy to say that the world is worse now, that people are more divided, that peace is more fragile. People have always said that, in every era. Yet something about the way we speak today feels different. I notice how rarely the word emerges in sincere conversation, how quickly it is replaced with talk of balance of power, personal boundaries, manageable levels of conflict, as if we no longer believe in a true ending of hostility, only in a negotiated pause. If you are still with me, if you have not yet clicked away to something lighter, then perhaps you feel some faint echo of what I am circling. I would ask you now, as a quiet companion in this late hour, not simply to listen but to respond. Leave your sign in this dim room. Let me know that you are here, walking this narrow corridor between scripture and shadow with me. Share whether you have noticed the absence of that word in your own circles, whether you feel it thinning out like mist at midday. It may seem trivial to you to type a brief message or to press a small symbol of approval on a screen, but for me, it is like seeing another candle flare in the distance. It tells me that I am not alone in perceiving a pattern that might otherwise swallow me whole. Tonight, as the flame beside me fights against its own exhaustion, I am trying to gather enough courage to acknowledge what the documents are really saying. They do not speak merely of language, of etymology and semantic drift. They speak of a countdown measured not in days or years, but in syllables and ink, in the presence or absence of a single word across the records of humanity. The prophecy, if we now dare to call it that, insists that there will come a generation that has grown so accustomed to conflict that it no longer remembers how to name its opposite. A generation in which the children learn about treaties as economic strategies, but no one teaches them the old blessing that once sent soldiers home and closed wounds between neighbors. When that generation becomes the majority, the covenant loosens. Of course, there is another possibility, the one I cling to when the silence grows heavy. It may be that we are not yet at that threshold, that somewhere in hidden corners there are still communities keeping the word alive, whispering it over meals and in dimly lit sanctuaries, writing it into letters that will never see publication. I do not know. What I do know is that the more I look, the less I find it in places where it used to reign. Political speeches speak of security, markets speak of stability, even many sermons speak of personal fulfillment and inner calm. But that old, simple blessing is increasingly treated as sentimental, a relic of a naive past. It is like a saint whose icon has been taken down, leaving only a discoloration on the wall. I find myself caught in a difficult place between skepticism and fear. On one side stands everything I have been taught about rigorous thought, about not leaping from data to metaphysics, about the danger of reading too much into coincidence. On the other side stands the stubborn testimony of countless anonymous hands that have scrawled their warnings across centuries, hands that never met each other and yet seem to be continuing the same conversation. They speak of an unspoken word, of a world that might forget it, and of a consequence too grave to reduce to metaphor. I turn their pages with fingers that sometimes tremble, and I ask myself how much of this I genuinely believe, and how much of it is the product of a mind that has spent too long in dim rooms with too little sleep. So I sit here in this small circle of candlelight, and I speak to you as honestly as I can. I am not certain. I am not a prophet, only a reader. I do not claim visions, only patterns. Yet I cannot ignore the sense that something is shifting in our shared language, that a slow, almost invisible theft is underway. If what I have found is even half true, then there is more at stake than a dictionary entry. There is a gate somewhere, written into the fabric of reality, and it is held shut by the ongoing use of a word that our age is beginning to dismiss. What happens when it swings open, and under whose authority, I do not yet know. That is part of the journey I will walk with you in the nights ahead, if you will walk them with me. For now, I ask only this. Remember the word. Speak it in your heart, even if you are embarrassed to say it aloud. Notice when it is missing, when other terms stand in its place like guards blocking the door. And if you feel that this search matters, if you sense that this slow forgetting is not an accident, then remain close. Add your presence to this small gathering of watchers who refuse to let the word vanish without a witness. There is more to tell, more to uncover, and I fear the truth as much as I long for it. But I will continue, because to turn away now would be to agree with the erasure, and I am not yet willing to surrender the last word that promises a world we have almost forgotten how to desire. There are moments in a man's life when the pursuit of truth ceases to feel noble and begins instead to feel like trespassing. I reached such a moment on a cold morning in late winter, when I found myself standing in the basement of an old theological institute, breathing in the dust of a forgotten archive that had not been opened since before my birth. The caretaker, an elderly man who spoke with a heavy Slavic accent, had led me down the narrow stone steps with a lantern held out in front of him, his hand trembling not from age but from something like reluctance. He did not ask why I wished to see the sealed documents. He only muttered that scholars who read too deeply into the Institute's oldest manuscripts tended to lose their sense of time, as if the pages devoured their hours. When he passed me the lantern and left me alone, I almost called him back. Almost, but it was too late. Curiosity had sunk into me like a hook, and I let the darkness draw me in. The archive was nothing more than a long corridor lined with wooden cabinets, their locks rusted, their hinges stiff. Some drawers contained nothing but fragments of parchment. Others were neatly filled with categorized files. I moved slowly, breathing cold air that smelled of mildew and something sweeter underneath, as though ancient ink still exhaled faintly after centuries of silence. I had come searching not for a prophecy, I still refused to use that word, but for evidence that would either confirm or dissolve the lingering suspicion that had shadowed my research for years. I wanted to find either a clear explanation for the linguistic disappearance of the old word, or a final piece that would allow me to dismiss the entire matter as coincidence. And yet, somewhere deep inside, I already knew that what I sought was not reassurance but understanding, regardless of how frightening that understanding might become. I unlatched the first cabinet and sifted through brittle pages of homilies, decrees, and letters that monks had once copied by candlelight. The scripts varied, some neat and practiced, others frantic, as though recorded in haste. My eye moved automatically across familiar blessings, genealogies, and formulas. until I noticed a pattern that sent a chill through me. In manuscript after manuscript, the blessing formula ended abruptly, the expected conclusion missing, not replaced, not paraphrased, simply missing. It was like a door frame with no door, a question left without an answer. A monk would write, "May the Lord grant you," and would leave 2 inches of empty parchment before moving to the next line. The absence was so consistent, so deliberate, that it felt like a silent rule no one dared break. In earlier manuscripts, the formula was always completed with that same ancient word. In later ones, never. My breath slowed as I traced the empty spaces with my fingertip. They felt colder than the rest of the page. I whispered the word silently to myself, the way a man might handle a relic he is not sure he deserves to touch. In that moment, even the lantern seemed to hesitate, its flame bowing toward the blank spaces as if listening. I reminded myself that I was a rational scholar, that ink does not carry intention, that parchment does not respond to whispers. And yet the silence in that room felt alive. There are silences in the world that are merely the absence of sound, and then there are silences that behave like watchers. This was the second kind. I moved deeper into the archive, opening drawer after drawer, each filled with documents that bore the same surgical omission. In some cases, the word had been scraped away entirely, leaving a faint scar on the parchment. In others, a faint ghost of the first letter remained, as if erased reluctantly. One document contained an annotation in the margin written in a delicate hand. "We no longer have permission." That phrasing struck me with particular force, because it did not say, "We should not." It said, "We cannot." Permission implies authority. Prohibition implies power. Something, or someone, had forbidden the utterance of that word. But who? The caretaker returned briefly, bringing me a thermos of hot tea, perhaps fearing I would freeze. He did not speak, but he watched me with an expression that hovered between pity and warning. His eyes lingered on the open pages, and he muttered something under his breath, too low for me to understand. When I asked if he recognized the pattern in the manuscripts, he shook his head quickly, denying before I finished the question. Only when he turned to leave did he whisper a single phrase. "Some things forgot themselves for a reason." And then he was gone again. "Forgot themselves," he had said. The phrasing troubled me. Can a word forget itself? Can language decide to withdraw? Scholars might call that animism, personification, the projection of human attributes onto abstractions. But the annotations I had seen in those manuscripts suggested something else entirely. Not a natural evolution of language, but an imposed forgetting. A forgetting enforced by fear. I turned that idea over in my mind like a stone with a hidden carving on its underside. If the old word truly held spiritual weight, as some apocryphal sources claimed, perhaps speaking it in an age unworthy of it would invoke not blessing but judgment. Still, I resisted believing anything supernatural. I returned to my training, grounding myself in historical method. I made careful notes about the dates of the manuscripts, comparing the handwriting styles, cross-referencing them with known events. I found that the systematic omission began during a century marked not by war, but by treaties. One might think that age would embrace the word for peace most fiercely. Instead, it is precisely then that the word begins to vanish. I stared at the timeline until my vision blurred. This was not loss through neglect. It was deletion. I spent 3 days in that archive, though my memory collapses them into one long evening. I slept there once, wrapped in my coat, using a stack of unused folders as a pillow. The caretaker did not stop me. He seemed relieved even that someone was willing to keep watch over the place. On the second night, something strange happened. As I was reading a set of homilies from a monk whose name appeared nowhere else in the historical record, I heard a faint sound, like paper brushing against paper. I froze. No breeze stirred the air. The lantern flame stood perfectly still, but the sound came again, soft and deliberate. When I followed it, I found that a set of pages, untouched for centuries, had shifted slightly, as if nudged by an unseen fingertip. Resting at the top of the stack was a single sheet I had not noticed before. It was a fragment, torn from a larger manuscript. The handwriting was small and shaky. The ink faded to brown. Only a few lines remained, but what I could read sent a tremor through my bones. The day will come when the nations forget the name that kept the heavens open. When that name grows thin upon the earth, the watchers will reclaim what is theirs. Beneath that line, a different hand had written in darker ink, firmer strokes. Speak it not after the turning. There was no explanation of what the turning was, no date, no event, no celestial sign. Only the warning. For hours I sat staring at those lines, unable to decide whether the fear creeping through me was justified or merely the effect of fatigue. I felt like a man who has wandered into a cathedral only to find that the statues have turned their heads to watch him. I tried to reason with myself. Prophetic language is common in monastic writings. Warnings of cosmic consequences are part of many traditions. But the specificity of the lines, the connection between the forgotten word and celestial authority, was unlike anything I had encountered in traditional commentary. It sounded less like religious metaphor and more like legal terminology. Reclaim what is theirs. Who were they? What claim did they have? And why would the erasure of one word trigger their right to act? I carried the fragment to the lantern and held it closer, searching for any clue to its origin. Under faint illumination, the ink glittered slightly, as though metallic particles had been mixed into it. I remembered reading once that some monastic scribes used ink infused with ground minerals for texts they considered powerful or dangerous. Could this be one of those? Or was I merely assigning mystical significance to what was, in truth, no more than decorative ink? I could no longer trust my own objectivity. The deeper I read, the more my mind began to draw connections I had not consciously allowed. Stories of ancient covenants in various traditions, tales of gates, watchers, heavenly councils, images scattered across cultures, suddenly seemed to align, like stars forming a constellation I had never noticed before. In biblical writings, there is the idea of heavenly beings who are assigned authority over nations. In apocryphal sources, there are references to the 70 guardians, figures whose mandate is to restrain or release judgment based on the moral condition of humanity. In certain Sumerian texts, there are echoes of celestial scribes who record the speech of mortals, weighing their words like grain. These myths were always treated as separate traditions, unrelated. Yet here, in this forgotten archive, I found hints that they might once have been fragments of the same larger story, scattered like pottery shards across continents and centuries. What if the ancient word I was studying was once understood to be more than a blessing? What if it was a declaration, a plea, a legal formula that kept certain powers at bay? If humanity ceased to speak it, ceased to remember it, would that silence be interpreted by those powers as consent to intervene? I was not ready to believe such a thing, but I was no longer able to dismiss it entirely. The documents in front of me spoke with a coherence that transcended coincidence. On the third day, as I was preparing to leave, the caretaker found me sitting at the wooden table, the fragment spread before me. He looked at the lines, then at me, and his face took on a solemn gravity I had not seen in him before. "You've found what others found," he said quietly, "and like them, you now carry the weight of it." "What happened to the others?" I asked. My voice sounded thinner than it should have. He shrugged one shoulder. "Some left their work and refused to speak of it again. Some stayed until their minds cracked like old plaster. A few tried to warn others, but the world does not listen to those who study silence." His words unsettled me. I packed my notes, the copies I had made, the photographs I had taken with the Institute's permission. As I ascended the stairs back into the world of windows and daylight, I felt something strange behind me. Not a presence, not a spirit, Nothing supernatural enough to name. It was more like the weight of countless eyes, ink eyes, watching me leave with a knowledge I had not yet earned. For several weeks afterward, I tried to live normally. I attended lectures, wrote articles, visited friends, answered emails. But everywhere I went, the world seemed wrapped in a thin fog of wrongness. I heard politicians speak of order and security, but not once did they invoke the old word. I read essays about international relations, psychological well-being, economic policy. The old word was absent. It appeared only in slogans, hollowed of meaning, used to sell merchandise or to decorate holiday cards. I searched religious broadcasts, sermons, debates. The word was still there, but spoken with less conviction, like a phrase recited more out of tradition than belief. One evening, as I sat alone with a cup of tea, I reviewed my notes and tried to map the timeline again. The pattern was unmistakable. The erasure had begun slowly, centuries ago, accelerated during periods of false stability, and had reached its peak in the present era. The old word remained technically known, yet spiritually forgotten. Spoken, yes, but not believed. Written, yes, but not trusted. And if the prophecy in the fragment was right, belief, not usage, was what kept the covenant bound. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of realization settle like dust on my chest. Had the world already crossed the threshold described in the texts? Had the turning already happened? If so, what came next? I wanted to dismiss all of this as mere overinterpretation, as paranoia born from too much isolation among old manuscripts. But then the dreams began. Dreams of a sky without stars, of cities humming with a strange static, of a river whose water whispered in a language I did not recognize but vaguely understood. The dreams did not frighten me, they warned me. And in each dream, a voice, not human, not quite divine, spoke a sentence I did not understand fully until much later. What you forget becomes what governs you. When I awoke from the third dream, shaking, breathing hard, I realized I could no longer pretend that my research was merely academic. I was inside something older and darker than the manuscripts themselves, something that had been unfolding for centuries while humanity busied itself with lesser anxieties. The covenant was fraying, the word was thinning, and the watchers, whatever they truly were waiting. I could not yet accept the truth of any supernatural claim, but I could no longer ignore the evidence. And so I began the second phase of my investigation, no longer as a scholar searching for explanations, but as a man trying to understand what his own era might be sleepwalking toward. What I found in the months that followed did not restore my peace, it dismantled it. And it became clear that the world was not merely forgetting the word, it was being taught to forget it, or perhaps being allowed to. There are thresholds a man crosses without realizing it, and only later, when he turns to look behind him, does he understand that the ground he stands upon is no longer the same. I crossed such a threshold in the spring that followed my winter in the archive. It began subtly, an uneasiness in the voice of a colleague, a missing phrase in a newly printed translation, a hesitation in the liturgy of a chapel I had attended for years. None of these things alone would have concerned me. But patterns rarely announce themselves with clarity. They whisper, they accumulate, they lean into your awareness until you can no longer pretend they are incidental. I told myself repeatedly that I was imagining things, that the manuscripts had merely cast a shadow over my perception. I had read too deeply, too obsessively. That was all. And yet, each time I tried to resume my ordinary life, the same dissonance returned, like a faint ringing in the ears that follows a single loud sound. It was during a guest lecture at a European theological faculty, a place known for its rationalism and its allergy to mystical thought, that I first realized the erasure was not confined to ancient manuscripts. The lecturer, a respected historian, was discussing the development of Christian blessing formulas across regions. It was a topic I had studied extensively, and I listened with mild interest, until he reached the section about benedictions. He explained how medieval formulas invoked divine mercy, protection, light, and healing. Then he said something that made my stomach clench. In later centuries, he said, the benedictions begin to shift toward broader, more human-centered virtues. Harmony, stability, mutual tolerance. I waited for him to say the word. He did not. He skipped over it as though it had never belonged there in the first place. When I raised my hand to ask about the omission, he frowned at me with a puzzled expression, as though he had never encountered the question. The term you're referring to, he said slowly, isn't particularly significant in the manuscripts. It appears here and there, but it's more poetic than theological. The more meaningful concepts are stability and order. My pulse quickened. That was demonstrably false. The old word was not peripheral. It was central. I had seen it with my own eyes in texts spanning centuries and continents, always occupying a sacred space in final blessings. For him to dismiss it so casually was not merely an academic difference. It was as though his internal lexicon had already been edited, as if some invisible hand had gone through his understanding and scraped the word away. After the lecture, I approached him privately. I asked if he had ever encountered manuscripts where the word was deliberately erased or replaced. He gave a gentle laugh, the patronizing laugh of a scholar indulging an eccentric colleague. My friend, he said, I think you're giving that term far more weight than it ever had. Cultures change, language changes. Sentimental vocabulary fades. Sentimental vocabulary. The casual cruelty of that struck me. How could a word that had once been the cornerstone of blessings, treaties, and prayers be dismissed as sentiment? How could a scholar, one who had devoted his life to studying these very texts, not feel the absence as keenly as I did? I left the faculty building with a heaviness that clung to me like damp wool. On the crowded tram back to my lodging, I watched the faces of passengers, students, workers, elderly couples, and felt a strange sorrow wash over me. Not one of them, I suspected, could recall the last time they had heard the old word spoken without irony or political baggage. Not one of them, perhaps, could feel that it had once carried a kind of holiness. That night, I sat in my rented room and opened every digital archive I had access to. I searched speeches, letters, news articles, sermons, scholarly papers. The pattern was unmistakable. The word appeared less frequently each decade. By the last few years, its usage had collapsed dramatically across all major languages, replaced almost universally by terms like stability, calm, security, harmony. All pale substitutes, all secularized, sanitized, stripped of transcendence. The deeper I searched, the clearer it became that this was not merely cultural drift. Something else was happening. Across nations, across ideologies, across languages, the same erasure was taking place. The old word was fading. The covenant-binding word, if the manuscripts were to be believed, was being forgotten. And then, new evidence found me, not the other way around. It came in the form of a message from a scholar I barely knew, a linguist who had once attended one of my presentations. Her email was brief, almost frantic. "I've seen it too," she wrote. "The word is disappearing, not only from texts, but from memory. People don't notice it missing. That is the strangest part. I found something in an Armenian manuscript. If you want to see it, come, but don't reply to this message. Just appear. No explanation, no details. Only those chilling words. People don't notice it missing." I traveled the next morning. A train first, then a bus, then a long walk through narrow stone streets to a small research room tucked behind a church older than most countries. The linguist greeted me with a nervous energy I recognized too well, the energy of someone who has glimpsed something they cannot unsee. Without speaking, she handed me a bound folder of scanned manuscripts. They were liturgical texts from the 18th century, written in Armenian script. She pointed to a specific page. At first glance, it looked like many I had seen, neat lines of ink, marginal annotations. But as I leaned closer, I noticed something disturbing. The primary scribe had written a benediction containing the old word. Then a second scribe had crossed it out. A third hand had rewritten it. A fourth had crossed it out again, and beneath the strokes of ink, faint but visible, was a note written in an older dialect. "This name is sealed until the rightful hour. Speak it not in the days of trembling." I felt my skin prickle. The linguist watched my reaction carefully, then whispered, "I checked with 3 colleagues. None of them could see the erased word. They saw only the replacements." "What do you mean?" I asked. They looked directly at the same manuscript, and when I asked them what word had been removed, they said the space was blank. Blank. As if nothing had ever been written there. Her voice trembled. "You saw it," she said to me, "because you already knew to look." We spent hours comparing notes. She had documented dozens of similar cases in Armenian, Syriac, Georgian, Greek. Each time, the same phenomena occurred. Multiple layers of erasure, conflicting hands, marginal warnings. And in each instance, modern readers failed to perceive the old word unless they approached the manuscript with prior knowledge. The texts themselves seemed to veil the word from unprepared minds. "This isn't ordinary censorship," she whispered. "It is like a veil. A veil, a sealing. A forgetting enforced not by editors but by something older." I left that meeting shaken in a way I did not want to admit. My rational mind fought desperately to stay upright, but the foundation beneath it had begun to shift. This was no longer merely evidence of linguistic decline. This felt like a coordinated phenomenon. Transcultural, transhistorical, almost sentient. That night, back in my room, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The dreams returned, more vivid than before. I saw ink moving on its own, rewriting itself. I saw libraries where certain shelves were swallowed by darkness. I saw a sky where a familiar constellation flickered and dimmed until only one star remained, pulsing like a warning. And I heard the voice again, clearer this time, closer. "What humanity forgets," it said, "we are permitted to claim." I woke with my heart pounding, soaked in sweat. For a long time I sat at the edge of the bed, breathing hard, listening to the slow hum of the world outside the window. A car passed, a night bird cried. Somewhere a church bell rang the hour. Ordinary sounds, human sounds, but layered beneath them for the briefest second. I thought I heard something else. A faint, distant resonance, like the low note of a shofar blown in warning. I tried to dismiss it as dream residue, but deep down, I already knew. I had crossed the threshold the manuscripts had warned of. There is a point in every investigation where evidence ceases to be intellectual and becomes personal. A point where the thing you are studying begins to study you back. And I understood, with a dread that settled into my bones, that I had begun to approach that point. For the next several weeks, I traveled to archives across Europe, searching for further clues, patterns, anything that might confirm or refute what I feared. Everywhere I went, the same signs appeared: erased words, altered blessings, marginal warnings, scholars who overlooked the gaps entirely. In an old monastery near the Alps, a monk in his 90s told me quietly that in his youth, he had heard elders speak of a covenant word, a sacred term that humans once carried like a torch. "But we lost the right to speak it," he said, eyes clouded with something like sorrow. So the heavens closed a little. In a digital archive in Scandinavia, I found an untranslated footnote from a medieval theologian. "When the world ceases to utter the final blessing, the guardians of the boundary awaken." In a museum in Italy, I found a liturgical tapestry with a blank space where a single embroidered word had been cut out with deliberate precision. The curator said the removal was ancient, predating the museum itself. "Superstition," she said with a shrug. They believed the thread carried power. Every new clue narrowed the path before me. Every erased blessing felt like a footstep toward an unseen precipice. And then, in a forgotten drawer of a university archive, I found the parchment that ended any possibility of denial. It was a small sheet, barely larger than my hand. On it, in a script older than any I had yet seen, was a single sentence. When the last tongue forgets the name of peace, the watchers return to claim the world written in their absence. The parchment shook slightly in my hands. My throat tightened. The room around me seemed to waver. There it was. Not metaphor, not allegory. A declaration. A legal statement written in a language older than any state on earth. I closed my eyes and whispered the old word softly, like an apology. And for the first time in my life, the word felt fragile, thin, endangered. The kind of word that might vanish with one final breath. And I understood, with a clarity that chilled me, that humanity had not merely forgotten the word. Humanity was being allowed to forget it, because the watchers were waiting. There are seasons in a man's life when he no longer seeks evidence, but instead follows the pull of something older than reason, a gravity of the soul. After the parchment with the ancient declaration entered my hands, my research ceased to feel like scholarship. It became pilgrimage. I walked through the world as if it were covered with a thin layer of ash. Every conversation, every newspaper headline, every gesture of hostility on a street corner felt like part of a slow, invisible burning. And everywhere I turned, the same question haunted me. What happens when the final tongue forgets? I traveled next to a small coastal observatory that had been abandoned decades earlier, perched on a cliff where the wind sang like a broken flute. I had come because a monk in the Alpine monastery had whispered to me, with trembling lips, that the old word had once been associated with a constellation, one sailors trusted to guide them home, one poets invoked in their longing, one mystics believed reflected the order of heaven. But look at the sky now, he had said, and his eyes had clouded with the weight of something only the dying perceive. Tell me if you still see it. The observatory smelled of old dust and salt. The wooden floor groaned beneath each step, as if protesting the intrusion of a living man. The telescope, cracked but intact, pointed toward a window where the glass was fogged with age. I wiped it clean with my sleeve and spent the entire night trying to align the telescope with the star charts I had brought. Those charts were ancient reproductions, filled with annotations in medieval Latin, Old French, Aramaic, Greek, languages that rarely shared a page, but in each of them, the same faint constellation appeared, small and easily overlooked, but always drawn with careful devotional strokes. It was called different names in different regions, some poetic, some mystical, some practical, but the meaning was always the same, the sign of final rest, the sign of the world healed. And yet, when I finally located the coordinate in the night sky, I found emptiness, not blankness, emptiness. A patch of darkness that looked deeper than the space around it, as if the stars had been erased from that region. I stared through the telescope for hours, blinking, adjusting, confirming what I already dreaded. The constellation was not merely lost to memory. It was gone. When I stepped outside for fresh air, I noticed something peculiar. The wind on the cliff carried a strange resonance, a faint vibration, almost inaudible but steady, like the distant hum of machinery. I stood still and realized with a chill that the frequency matched the exact pitch I had heard in my recurring dreams, the low, trembling note that had accompanied the voice speaking of forgotten names and reclaimed worlds. The stars, it seemed, were speaking in their absence. I returned to the observatory table and spread out the manuscripts, tracing the ancient word with my fingertip. And in that fragile silence, I felt a thought form, slow and dread-filled. The sky is obeying the silence of the earth, as though the heavens themselves were bound by the forgetting. as though something written in the unseen covenant was unfolding in real time. My rational mind rebelled. I wanted to dismiss the idea, to remind myself that constellations shift with time, that star brightness changes, that telescopes decay. But the insistence of the manuscripts, the astronomical precision of the ancient annotations, and the unnatural emptiness of that sky region formed a triad of evidence too coherent to ignore. Something was aligning, or rather, misaligning. The next phase of my investigation took me into the realm of forgotten histories. Not myths, not theology, but civilizations erased from human memory. I traveled to a museum archive in the Balkans, where an archaeologist had once mentioned to me a set of clay tablets discovered near the ruins of a settlement that had no known name, no matching linguistic lineage. She had dismissed them as ceremonial artifacts, undeciphered and likely unimportant, but she had allowed me to view them, perhaps sensing that I was seeking something outside the usual categories of scholarship. The tablets were small, rough, carved with symbols that resembled neither Sumerian cuneiform nor Proto-Aramaic, nor linear B. The shapes were sharp, angular, almost defensive in their geometry. I asked permission to photograph them under varying wavelengths of light. To my shock, the carvings changed slightly under ultraviolet illumination, revealing faint strokes that were invisible in normal light. I recorded everything meticulously and spent days cross-referencing the shapes with ancient alphabets. Then, late one evening, while adjusting contrast on a high-resolution scan, I noticed a repeated symbol, 3 strokes arranged in a triangular form. It appeared on every tablet, always at the end of a sequence, always accompanied by another symbol resembling an open gate. It took me hours to accept what I was seeing. The triangular mark was nearly identical to an archaic representation of the old word in a pre-Hebraic script, one so old that it had been categorized as proto-symbolic, not linguistic. The gate symbol, which followed it, matched depictions in ancient Near Eastern mythology of boundary watchers, beings assigned to guard cosmic thresholds. Thresholds between what and what? Ancient texts were rarely gentle with their answers. The archaeologist, noticing my trembling hands, asked what I had found. I lied. I said I needed more time. Because how could I tell her that her undeciphered tablets were not ceremonial at all, but warnings? Warnings from a civilization whose name we do not know because it may have ceased to exist precisely when it forgot the old word. I left the museum with a grim understanding. This was not the first world to forget. Civilizations had risen, grown powerful, proud, and then disappeared, not because of war, famine, or disaster, but because they crossed the line of forgetting. The line where peace is not spoken, not written, not believed. A line the watchers consider consent. I traveled next to a desert region in the Middle East, guided by a reference in one of the apocryphal fragments I had studied. It spoke of a monastery long vanished, built near a dried river whose waters had once been considered sacred. Locals knew only rumors, a place where monks had once guarded a forbidden name until they vanished overnight, leaving only scorched stone and a silence no one wished to disturb. The desert was vast and hostile. Wind carried sand like broken glass. The sun burned without mercy. But by the second day of walking, I found it. A ruin half swallowed by the earth, shattered pillars rising like ribs from a buried beast, and in the center, an altar, blackened as if struck by lightning. On its surface, carved so deeply that time had failed to erase it, was the old word. Incomplete, half destroyed. The first 2 letters were intact, the rest obliterated. Beside it was a smaller carving, unfamiliar but painfully clear in its intention. An eye open above the earth, and above the eye, 7 strokes, radiating like a crown. I knelt beside the altar as the wind howled around me, and in that desolate place, I felt something I had not felt before. Not fear, not awe, but recognition. The Watchers were not metaphors. They were not poetic symbols. They were beings bound by law. A law older than any scripture, a law written into the architecture of creation. Their authority was limited by the old word, but when the word faded, their jurisdiction expanded. Civilizations rose and fell under their gaze, and humanity had never understood why. As I traced the half-erased carving, an unbearable thought took shape. What if the disappearance of peace from our language is not failure but fulfillment? What if humanity, through pride or exhaustion, has finally fulfilled the condition that grants the Watchers open claim? When I stood to leave, I noticed something carved into the stone nearby, a message left by a monk whose hand had survived centuries of decay. We guarded the word, but the world no longer wished for it, and when a blessing is no longer desired, it becomes judgment. I walked away from the ruins knowing I had crossed another threshold. There was no longer any doubt. The manuscripts, the sky, the tablets, the ruins, all pointed to one truth. Humanity was forgetting the word that protected it, and the Watchers, bound by covenant, were preparing to step through the opening silence. As I made my journey back through the desert, the wind carried a strange sound. Not like speech, not like chant, but like a name spoken from the other side of a door that had begun to open. There comes a point in every long search when the world itself begins to rearrange around the seeker, as if reality were a veil stirred by breath, responsive, pliable, almost listening. After the desert ruins and the half-erased carvings that whispered of collapsed civilizations, my mind shifted into a state I can only describe as sharpened dread. I was no longer moving through archives and landscapes in search of evidence. I was moving through evidence embodied in the world itself. Everything became a clue. Every silence became a sign. Every omission felt intentional. And while I still clung to fragments of rationality, they dangled like frayed ropes above a chasm that grew wider each day. It was during this period that I found myself in a valley in southern France, an unassuming place marked by vineyards, limestone cliffs, and villages with terracotta roofs. A friend had mentioned an ancient convent sealed off by the government decades ago after a landslide had rendered it unsafe. But what drew me was not the place itself. It was the rumor attached to it. Local elders still whispered about a relic the nuns had guarded, a manuscript said to contain the word that keeps the world intact. Most dismissed the story as folklore, the sort of poetic exaggeration rural communities attach to ruins. Yet the phrase haunted me. The word that keeps the world intact. In the language of my research, it meant only one thing. The convent sat beneath a ridge of shattered rock, its roof partially collapsed, ivy crawling through cracked masonry. Entering it felt like trespassing into a mausoleum. Dust coated everything. Bird nests filled alcoves where candles once burned, and yet the air carried a lingering scent of something sweet. Incense, perhaps, trapped in the stones for centuries. I expected to find mere debris. Instead, behind a fallen beam, I uncovered a narrow staircase leading downward, its walls soot-stained as if touched by fire long ago. I descended slowly, lantern in hand, breath tight with expectation and unease. The stairs ended in a chamber shaped like an elongated hexagon, its ceiling low, its walls covered in frescoes nearly erased by time. At the center stood a stone pedestal, and on the pedestal, a wooden chest, charred but intact. When I opened it, my pulse faltered. Inside lay a manuscript wrapped in layers of linen and wax. The linen crumbled under my fingers. The wax flaked away like old skin. What emerged was a codex unlike any I had ever seen, bound in dark leather, its pages thick and fibrous, as though made from a blend of parchment and some unknown, organic material. The script was unfamiliar, a fluid mixture of Latin characters and symbols that resembled musical notation. At first, none of it made sense, but as I turned the pages, patterns began to reveal themselves. The codex was a chronicle, half theological, half astronomical, written by the nuns who once lived above. They described a lineage of women who preserved a single sacred word passed orally from one generation to the next. They called themselves custodes vocis, guardians of the voice. Their mission, stated plainly on one page, was to remember aloud what the world forgets, lest the heavens withdraw their protection. My breath stopped as I read further. We speak the word each dawn, even if no one hears. We breathe it into the walls so that the stone remembers. For if ever a time comes when it is not spoken by any living tongue, the covenant dissolves and the witnesses of the boundary reclaim dominion. The witnesses of the boundary, the watchers. Another page recounted a vision shared by 3 sisters during a night of fasting. They saw a sky without the constellation of rest. They saw cities filled with silent screams, and they heard the watchers whisper, "Your age has forgotten the name. We will come when silence is complete." My hands trembled as I copied the passage into my notebook. But the deeper I went, the stranger the text became. It described not only the cosmic consequences of forgetting the word, but also the psychological ones. According to the chronicler, when a civilization abandons the concept the word represents, not merely in speech but in longing, the human mind begins to shift. Fear becomes a default state. Violence becomes rationalized. Compromise feels weak. Unity feels suspicious. And slowly, imperceptibly, the ability to imagine peace disappears. The chronicle described this as the inward famine. A people who can no longer imagine peace will no longer desire it, the nun wrote. And a people who no longer desire it withdraw the final barrier between themselves and the watchers. I closed the codex and sat in that dark chamber for a long time, shaking. I did not want to believe it. And yet everything I had seen across nations, archives, and cultures supported it. We live in a time when peace is not merely diminished, it is distrusted, mocked, seen as weakness, a relic of idealists. The very idea of a world without violence now seems unrealistic, utopian, almost childish. And that, according to the chronicle, is the final sign. When I finally left the convent, night had fallen. The moon hung low and red, tinted by dust drifting through the valley. As I stepped outside, a tremor passed through the earth, small but unmistakable, a rumble like a throat clearing. My instincts screamed that something ancient had shifted, that some threshold had thinned just a fraction more. My next destination was a region of the Caucasus, where rumors had long circulated about a collection of lost apocrypha taken from a monastery destroyed in the 19th century. These texts, if they existed, were said to contain descriptions of celestial beings assigned to oversee the moral compass of humanity. Beings sometimes portrayed as angels, sometimes as judges, sometimes as forces of nature. I traveled through narrow mountain roads, past villages where old women still murmured blessings in front of crumbling stone crosses. The monastery ruins lay high on a plateau, reachable only by a steep footpath. When I arrived, the air felt unusually thin, the silence sharp enough to sting the ears. A local guide, an elderly man with a long beard and a face carved by wind, led me to a small cave beneath the ruins where monks had once hidden manuscripts during invasions. He warned me not to linger. "This place remembers sorrow," he said, "and sorrow remembers everything else." Inside the cave, I found a wooden crate wrapped in decaying rope. Inside the crate, scrolls, parchment fragments, bound codices. Some were too damaged to read. Others bore scripts I recognized: Syriac, Greek, Old Armenian. But one manuscript stood out immediately. It was rolled tightly, sealed with a hardened lump of resin. Embedded in the resin was a symbol, a triangle, and above it, 7 radiating lines. The same symbol I had seen in the desert ruins. The Watcher's Mark. When I unrolled the scroll, my breath caught. It contained a series of visions attributed to a monk named Stephanos, who lived more than 1,000 years ago. He spoke of the guardians of the border between realms, beings whose authority increased when humanity abandoned certain sacred obligations. In one passage, he wrote, "The covenant depends on the utterance of the word that binds chaos, not for its sound, but for the desire it represents. Should humanity cease to desire peace, the covenant dissolves, for the watchers then judge that the world no longer resists their rule." The detail that struck me most was this: the watchers do not bring war, they bring order. The order of silence, the order of relinquished hope, the order of a world that has surrendered its claim to mercy. In other words, their rule is not violent. It is final. A world emptied of striving for peace becomes a world ready for ownership. This aligned with the desert ruins, the constellations' disappearance, the erased blessings, the Armenian manuscripts. Humanity's forgetting was not accidental. It was a slow compliance with a condition older than empires. Yet there was more. At the bottom of the scroll, Stephanos described a final sign: when the last city ceases to pray for peace, not in ritual but in longing, the watchers will unseal the gates of claim, and the skies will answer the silence of men. I knew then that I had to investigate the modern world directly. Not manuscripts, not ruins, not dreams, but society itself. I traveled to cities across Europe and America, observing public rituals, ceremonies, political speeches. Everywhere I listened for the longing the scroll described. Not the word itself, that still appeared occasionally, but the longing behind it. I found little. People wished for safety. People wished for stability. People wished for victory. But longing, deep, aching, desperate longing for true peace, was almost extinct. I visited churches where prayers were spoken with a tone of resignation. I visited memorials where the silence felt heavy but aimless. I watched leaders speak of diplomacy not as healing but as strategy. The old word had become a sound without breath, and longing had become obsolete. In one American city, I attended a vigil for victims of violence. Thousands gathered in the main square, holding candles against the cold. And yet, when the speaker invited the crowd to pray for peace, there was an awkward pause. People exchanged uncertain glances, as if the request were strangely unfamiliar. Many lowered their candles, others remained silent. Only a handful spoke the word aloud. And in that moment, standing in that vast crowd of flickering lights, I felt something slip inside the world, as if one more thread of the covenant had snapped. I left the vigil shaken, hearing once again the voice from my dreams: "What humanity forgets, we are permitted to claim." But now I understood something I had not before. The watchers were not waiting for a spoken word to disappear. They were waiting for the human heart to stop yearning for what the word represents. And that time, my soul knew it, my bones knew it, was nearly complete. The world was forgetting not only the word, but the very possibility of peace. And when the longing dies, the claim begins. There are truths that do not announce themselves with thunder or visions, but reveal their shape slowly, like a footprint emerging in melting snow. By the time I began the 6th chapter of my investigation, the world around me had taken on a new, disquieting texture. Streets, conversations, newspapers, everything felt as though some subtle scaffolding had been removed, leaving human life standing without its hidden supports. The absence of the old word, once theoretical, then historical, then spiritual, had become perceptible in daily existence, like a pressure drop before a storm. And the more I traveled, the more I sensed that the storm had already begun, not as a sudden catastrophe, but as a gradual rearrangement of the human spirit. It was during this contemplative unrest that I received an invitation from a university in northern Canada, an institute specializing in anthropology, folklore, and indigenous cosmologies. A researcher there claimed to have found something that resonated precisely with the silence I had been writing about in private notes. Her phrasing alone was enough to unsettle me, resonated with the silence. Few scholars understood the concept. Fewer still would describe it with such precision. I took the next flight. The university stood at the edge of a vast boreal forest, its buildings low and wide, surrounded by snow so pristine it seemed untouched by footsteps or even time. Inside, the researchers had gathered fragments of oral traditions from tribes across the region, stories passed down through generations in whispers, chants, and ceremonial recitations. The researcher who had invited me, a quiet woman with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing, welcomed me into her office. Without preamble, she placed a small, carved wooden box on the table between us. "You've been following the disappearing word?" she said. It was not a question. "Yes," I answered. "And the Watchers?" I hesitated. "Yes." "Then you need to see this." She opened the box. Inside was a bundle of birch bark scrolls tied with sinew. The bark was cracked in places, but the ink, made from sap and charcoal, was surprisingly vivid. "These are pre-contact narratives," she said. "They survived only because one family guarded them through relocations, pandemics, and forced conversions. Most dismiss them as myth, but you'll see otherwise." She handed me the first scroll. The symbols carved into its surface were not letters in the modern sense. They resembled pictographs arranged in sequences that formed a kind of narrative syntax. At the top was the image of a great tree, its branches stretching into the sky, its roots sinking into the deep earth. Beneath it stood 3 figures with hollow eyes. Around them spiraled lines indicating sound. "These," she said, pointing to the figures, "are the keepers of the breath. In their tradition, the world remains in balance only as long as humanity speaks certain sacred breaths, words that align the earth and sky." I nodded, feeling that familiar tightening in my chest. She continued. "One of those breaths was the word for peace. But in this tradition, the word isn't merely the absence of conflict. It means something closer to the joining of what was separated, a return to original harmony." She unrolled more of the bark. The next scene depicted people speaking the sacred breath into the sky. Above them, stars arranged themselves into a constellation shaped like a circle with an open center, a symbol I recognized immediately. It was the same constellation the Alpine monk had said would vanish when the word faded. My pulse quickened. "And then?" I asked. She unrolled further. The next section showed the people turning away from the sacred breath. Their mouths were closed. The sky began to darken. The constellation dimmed. And from the open center of the circle descended 3 towering beings with elongated limbs and blank faces. I pointed to the figures. "The Watchers," I whispered. "In their language," she said. "They are called the Silent Ones. They don't speak, they listen, and they answer silence with their own silence." "What does that mean?" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "When humanity stops desiring harmony, the Silent Ones descend, not to destroy, not to punish, but to take ownership. A world without the sacred breath belongs to them by ancient accord." The words struck me with cruel familiarity. Another culture, another century, yet the same story. Forgetting the sacred breath opens the gate. I asked her if the tradition mentioned how the sacred breath could be restored. She shook her head. "In every version," she said softly, "once the forgetting reaches a certain depth, the breath cannot be revived by human effort. Its return depends on something else, something outside human will." We spent hours studying the scrolls. The final one showed a lone figure standing at the edge of a cliff, mouth open, not in despair, but in proclamation. Above him, the constellation reappeared faintly, like embers stirred back to life. "This figure," she said, "is a symbol, a reminder that sometimes a single voice can rekindle what was lost, but only if the world has not crossed the threshold entirely." "And if it has?" I asked. She closed the scroll and returned it to the box. "Then the Silent Ones come." As I left the university that evening, walking through the snow toward the guest house, I felt the cold seep into my bones with an intensity I had never experienced. The forest loomed on both sides like a cathedral of shadows. Above, the northern sky stretched in colors of green and blue, shifting softly like a curtain in slow motion. I tried to find the missing constellation, but the sky offered only emptiness where ancient maps promised stars. That night, in my small room, I dreamed again. This time, the dream began with a whisper, not the low hum I had heard before, but a soft, nearly human sound, a breath, a word, not spoken, but remembered. And then a voice, not mine, not divine, not fully human, said, "You are approaching the hour of the unveiled silence." I woke with my heart pounding, the room too still. I opened the window and let the night air in. The aurora flickered. A distant howl echoed through the forest. For the first time, I sensed the watchers not as myth or allegory, but as presence. Something ancient, patient, waiting beyond the veil of sound and memory. Over the next weeks, my investigation took me further into fields I had never expected to traverse. Anthropology, psychology, acoustics, even quantum physics. Everywhere, I found hints of the same truth. The human capacity to desire peace had eroded far more deeply than I had realized. I interviewed psychologists who said modern children struggle to imagine nonviolent resolutions in role-play scenarios. I interviewed diplomats who privately admitted that public rhetoric about peace had become performative, lacking conviction. I listened to focus groups in which ordinary people described peace not as aspiration, but as fantasy. Something unavailable, unrealistic, even suspicious. Suspicious. That was the word one man used. "We don't trust peace anymore," he said. "It feels like a trick." A trick. The longing that once held civilizations together had curdled into doubt. At a conference in Berlin, I watched a panel discuss the future of global stability. Their language was clinical, strategic, devoid of desire. When a young audience member asked why no one had mentioned peace, the panelists exchanged a look that chilled me. The same look the theologian had given me months earlier when I asked about the missing blessing. A look of absence, a look of unknowing, a look of forgetting. That night, in my hotel room overlooking the Spree River, I wrote a sentence in my notebook that frightened me more than anything I had discovered in manuscripts or ruins. Humanity has not merely forgotten the word. Humanity has forgotten how to want what the word represents. The longing had died. The inside famine was complete. And if the old texts were correct, the watchers were no longer waiting. They were preparing. Yet even as dread tightened around me, another thought flickered. Quiet, fragile, persistent. If one voice can rekindle the lost breath, if one heart can still long for peace in its true form, then perhaps the threshold has not been crossed completely. But to test that possibility, to speak the word aloud, knowingly, in an age of forgetting, would be to draw the attention of the watchers directly. And that is a cost I was not yet prepared to bear. There are nights when reality feels porous, when the world thins like old parchment held too close to flame. By the time I reached the 7th chapter of this journey, I had begun to sense that something unseen was pressing closer, not in dramatic visions or supernatural encounters, but in subtle distortions of daily life. Sounds lingered longer than they should. Shadows clung to mundane objects with unusual weight. Conversations contained pockets of silence that felt intentional, watchful. I began to feel observed, not in the paranoid sense of being watched by people, but in the older, more ancient sense of being witnessed by forces that existed long before humanity learned to hide its eyes from the dark. It was during this fragile period that I received a message from a colleague in Jerusalem, an archaeologist who had spent his career studying inscriptions from the Second Temple period. His note was brief. "I found a stone. You need to see it for yourself. It bears the mark you wrote about." The mark, the Watcher's symbol. The triangle beneath 7 strokes. I flew out within 2 days. The site lay just outside the old city, in an area rarely visited by tourists, partially excavated, fenced, and covered with tarps flapping in the desert wind. My colleague, a stern but kind man with deep lines carved by years of sun and sand, greeted me with an unusual solemnity. "I thought you were exaggerating," he said as he led me down into the trench. "But after seeing this, I am not so sure." We reached a slab of limestone half buried in compacted soil. It was smooth on one side, cracked on the other, but unmistakable in its carvings. There, etched with a precision uncommon for its era, was the triangular mark. Above it, 7 lines radiated outward like a sunburst or a crown. Beneath it, written in an archaic form of Aramaic, were words that froze the blood in my veins. "When the final blessing is silent, the watchers rise." My colleague stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow, though the air was cool. "I don't understand it," he whispered. "This stone predates known apocalyptic texts, yet it mirrors the imagery you've been describing." I knelt before the stone, tracing the carvings with cautious fingers. The grooves were shallow but deliberate, made by a hand that understood symbolism beyond its age. And the stone was not part of a tomb, a temple, or a monument. It had been part of a door frame. "A threshold," I murmured. My colleague nodded. "A warning at the entrance of something," he said. "A monastery, a dwelling, a sanctuary." But to me it felt like more. A threshold marks transition, a boundary, a crossing point. It echoed the term used in the desert manuscripts, the boundary. When I pressed my palm flat against the stone, the surface felt warm, not with sunlight, but with something deeper, like the lingering heat of a presence long departed. "What else did you find?" I asked. He swallowed hard. "Fragments, symbols, and one scroll." He brought it out from a protective box, a thin, brittle parchment sealed between 2 sheets of glass. The writing on it was faint, almost vanishing, yet coherent enough to read. "The word weakens, the longing fades, the covenant loosens, and when the gates open, the watchers claim what humanity has relinquished." The script broke off there, torn or rotted. But it was enough. Standing in that trench, I felt a sensation I had known only once before, decades earlier, as a child, when I wandered too far into the forest and suddenly realized I was not alone. A feeling of being studied by something that existed outside my understanding of the natural world. I turned to my colleague. "You must hide this stone," I said. "Hide it? Why?" "Because the last time such warnings surfaced, the places guarding them were destroyed." He stared at me, disbelief mixing with discomfort. "You think something will try to erase this?" "I don't think," I whispered. "I have seen." But it was too late. Because that night, as I sat in my hotel room overlooking the silent Jerusalem streets, I received a second message. This one from the Canadian researcher who had shown me the birch bark scrolls. Her email contained only 4 words. "They are moving now." No explanation, no details. Just that. My heart pounded. I wrote back immediately, but my message bounced. Her account no longer existed. I barely slept. Shadows flickered despite the stillness of the room. A low hum reverberated through my mind when I tried to rest, subtle, rhythmic, like a distant engine or the echo of something enormous shifting in a realm adjacent to ours. The next morning I received news that chilled me. A fire had broken out overnight at the University Archive in Canada. The birch bark scrolls were lost. The carved wooden box was gone. The researcher was missing. Missing! No record of departure, no sign of struggle. Just absence. I sat at the edge of my bed, trembling, understanding with a clarity I did not want. The watchers were erasing the evidence, not all at once, but strategically, surgically, as if stepping closer each time humanity drew nearer to rediscovering what had been buried. I left Jerusalem that afternoon, But the sense of pursuit did not leave me. Airports felt uncanny, too bright, too quiet. Passengers around me seemed unaware of the thinness in the air, the tension humming under the surface of everyday life. On the flight home, I dreamed for the first time with perfect clarity. I stood in a vast plain beneath a starless sky. Before me rose a gate, not metaphorical, not symbolic, but tangible, carved of stone that shimmered like obsidian. It was sealed by a single word written in fire, the old word. Behind the gate, something moved, not with malice, not with hunger, but with inevitability, like a tide pressing against a shore that had forgotten its duty to stand firm. Then a voice spoke beside me. It was the same voice that had visited my dreams before. Ancient, resonant, neither male nor female, neither kind nor cruel. "You see now," it said, "the forgetting is almost complete." I wanted to ask how much time remained. I wanted to ask whether humanity could still turn back. I wanted to ask whether I, only one man, could matter in this vast unfolding. But before I could speak, the voice continued. "There is still one thread. There is still one longing that has not been extinguished, one heart that remembers the breath." I woke with tears on my face, not from fear, from recognition. I knew the voice was speaking about me, not as a chosen one, nothing so grandiose, but as a final, fragile thread tying humanity to the covenant. Not because I had power, but because I still longed, fully, fiercely, for peace in its original and sacred sense. When I arrived home, I found my apartment undisturbed, yet somehow altered. My notebooks sat where I had left them. My manuscripts were intact. My lantern still rested on the desk. And yet the room carried an unmistakable feeling, as though something had entered while I was away. Not to search, not to steal, but simply to witness. I stood in the quiet, my chest tightening, and whispered the old word aloud. Not experimentally, not academically, but as a plea, a longing, a declaration. The moment the word left my lips, a soft crackling sound filled the room, like old wood adjusting, like distant thunder rumbling beneath the floorboards. The air grew heavier. Time seemed to thicken. And then I felt it, a presence behind me, not threatening, not benevolent, but attentive, as though something had heard, as though something had turned its gaze toward me across a vast and ancient distance. I did not look back. I could not. I simply closed my eyes and whispered the word again, not louder, but truer. The presence lingered for several seconds, and then it withdrew. When it was gone, the room felt emptier than before, but I stood there, knowing with a clarity deeper than bone. Speaking the word had changed something. Not in the world, not yet, but in the alignment of forces poised above it. For the watchers had heard me, and I knew that from this point on, my life would be measured not by days or years, but by how long I could continue whispering the word the world had forgotten. There comes a moment in a long and perilous search when the seeker realizes he is no longer merely uncovering truth. He is being led toward it, guided, watched, not by benevolent forces nor malevolent ones, but by a kind of ancient inevitability that observes quietly from the edges of perception. By the time I entered the 8th stage of this journey, I understood that I had ceased to be a neutral researcher. I had become a participant in a drama older than kings, older than empires, older even than the languages that once bound heaven and earth together. From the moment I whispered the old word aloud in my darkened room, the world began to speak back, not in sentences, not in omens, but in disruptions of the familiar logic that had once governed my life. Objects shifted slightly when I returned to them. Clocks stalled for 3 seconds and then resumed as if nothing had happened. Streetlights flickered when I passed beneath them, not randomly but rhythmically, almost as if pulsing in response to an unheard frequency in the air around me. and the dreams intensified. For nights on end, I saw the watchers as silhouettes, tall, slender, shifting like pillars of wind, faceless yet unmistakably focused on me, observing with a patience that weighed on my chest like an invisible hand. They did not move in the dreams. They tilted, like vast reeds bending in a direction imperceptible to human geometry. And always, always, the same message echoed through the dreamscape like a whisper moving beneath ice. You remember, you long, you delay the silence. I awoke each morning trembling, drenched in sweat, yet filled with a strange and solemn determination. Every whisper of the word, every flicker of yearning within me, seemed to hold back a tide that I could not fully comprehend. But such resistance could not last without consequence. The more I whispered the word, the more the world around me responded, and not always gently. It began with small distortions in sound. In cafes and libraries, I would overhear conversations in which the final words dropped away into nothing, as though swallowed by a mute force that hovered between speakers. People would not notice. They continued speaking, unaware of the missing fragments. But I noticed. I noticed because I felt those silences, thick, weighted, unnatural, press against my awareness like a cold fingertip tracing the inside of my skull. Next came the shadows. I walked through a city park one late afternoon, trying to steady my thoughts, when I noticed my own shadow stretching farther than it should have, twice as long as the angle of the sun warranted. At first, I assumed it was a trick of the eyes, but then, as I paused beneath a cluster of bare trees, I saw a second shadow beside mine, not matching my movements, not connected to anything that cast it, just standing there. Long, narrow, unnaturally straight-edged. When I turned to look, nothing was there. When I turned back, the second shadow was gone, but the dread it left behind remained. It was soon after that I received the letter. Not an email, not a phone call, a letter, handwritten, slipped under my door sometime during the night. There was no return address. The handwriting was uneven, shaky, as if written by someone afraid. It contained only one sentence. They will not harm you, but they will demand silence. No salutation, no signature, no explanation. I read it again and again, feeling a tightening in my throat each time. Was it from the Canadian researcher? Was she alive? Could she have escaped the destruction of the scrolls? The handwriting did not match hers, but fear can distort a hand. Or perhaps the message came from someone else, someone who had crossed this threshold before me, someone who had survived long enough to send a warning. As I sat with the letter, the lamp beside me dimmed, flickered, and then brightened once more. A small gust of cold passed through the closed room, rattling papers on the desk. And in that moment, I understood. The watchers were not simply near. They were aware, and they knew my name. I decided then that I needed to leave my apartment. Not to flee. There is nowhere to flee from forces that stand outside geography, but to seek a place older than the fears gathering around me. A place where the word might still echo in the stones, even if only faintly. My instinct drew me to a monastery in Eastern Europe, a place whispered about by archivists, a place that stood on a hill where wars had passed but never settled, a place where chanting still formed a bridge between the ancient and the modern. I traveled by night train through snow-covered fields, the rhythmic clattering of wheels offering a rare semblance of comfort. Yet even there, in the insulated calm of the compartment, I felt the watcher's presence, subtle but steady, like a vibration running through the metal of the carriage. At dawn, I reached the monastery, a stark stone fortress rising above a valley blanketed in frost. The monks greeted me with the quiet solemnity of men who had long ago surrendered worldly concerns. Their leader, an elder monk whose eyes were pale blue like distant sky, listened to my request with an expression I could not decipher. "You seek the old word," he said at last. "Yes," I replied. my voice low. "And you have spoken it." "Yes." A long silence followed. He studied me as though measuring the weight of my spirit. "You feel them," he murmured, almost to himself. "Yes." He nodded slowly. Then he led me into a small chapel carved partly into the mountain rock itself. At the center stood an ancient stone slab, older than the monastery, older than the current civilization. Upon it, faintly carved, was the same triangular symbol I had seen in the desert and Jerusalem. But below it, so faded it was nearly invisible, was the old word, not complete, broken, missing its final letter. "The world has forgotten it," the monk said. "We have tried to remember, we chanted at dawn, but the final syllable dies in the air. It refuses to be spoken." I felt a chill race through me. "Why?" He touched the stone gently. "Because longing has left the world," he said. "Sound without longing has no power." I closed my eyes, and then something unexpected happened. The monk stepped closer to me, his expression solemn. "You are not the first in this age to seek the word," he said, "but you are the first who still carries its longing intact." I opened my eyes, startled. "How can you know that?" He smiled faintly. "Because they follow you." I froze. "They?" He nodded. "The Watchers. We have felt their presence since the moment you entered our gates. They do not linger around empty souls, only those who pose a challenge to the silence." I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding. "What do they want from me?" "Not your life," he said quietly. "Only your quiet." He placed a hand on my shoulder, his voice lowering. "They will try to convince you to stop speaking, stop longing, stop remembering." Then he met my eyes with a gravity that shook me. "You must not let them." We stood there in the cold chapel, two men bearing the weight of something that should have belonged to gods. I asked him then the question that had haunted me for months. Is there truly no way to restore the word? To restore the longing? To hold the Watchers at bay? The monk exhaled slowly. "The word cannot return to the world," he said, "until one person speaks it with its full meaning in his heart. And if that is not enough, then nothing ever was." We prayed together, not with ritual, but with silence. And in that silence, I felt the Watchers beyond the chapel walls, listening, waiting, measuring the depth of my resolve. As I left the monastery that evening, snow crunching beneath my boots, I felt a presence behind me, not threatening, not violent, but insistent. A cold wind brushed the back of my neck. A shadow lengthened beside mine, and a whisper not made of sound reached me. "Be silent, and the world will pass peacefully into our hands." But I kept walking, and with every step, I whispered the old word beneath my breath. Not loudly, not defiantly, but with longing. Because longing, I now understood, was the final thread holding the world together. There is a moment in every long descent when the seeker realizes he has crossed a point of no return, not with fanfare, not with revelation, but with the quiet certainty that the path ahead can no longer be undone. As I began the 9th stretch of this journey, I understood with unsettling clarity that I was no longer walking toward knowledge. I was walking toward confrontation. The Watchers, those ancient witnesses of human longing and its collapse, were no longer distant silhouettes haunting the horizon of my dreams. They were near, close enough that their silence pressed into the marrow of my bones like cold fingers. Close enough that the word I carried within me, the last remnant of a covenant older than cities, felt like a flame cupped between trembling hands in a wind that wished to extinguish it. Yet even as fear tightened its grip around me, another sensation grew, quiet, fragile, stubborn. Not courage, not hope. Something more elusive, a refusal to surrender the memory of peace, even if the world had already made its decision. A refusal to let the Watchers interpret humanity's silence as consent. That refusal became the compass guiding me into the final and most perilous phase of my investigation. I left the eastern monastery and traveled eastward, following a trail of references so obscure they existed only in footnotes of footnotes. Mentions of a threshold city, a place where ancient scribes once gathered to reaffirm covenants between heaven and earth. Most historians dismissed it as myth, a metaphor for spiritual transition, but the monks believed otherwise. They said the threshold city was real, though few knew its location. Some claimed it lay beneath the ruins of Hattusa. Others insisted it was hidden in the Caucasus or swallowed by the shifting sands of Turkmenistan. But the elder monk who had spoken with me in the chapel took my hand before I departed and whispered a single location: go to Ani. Ani, the city of 1,000 churches, the city abandoned to time. A ghost of stone and silence on the border between worlds and nations. I had visited Ani once as a young scholar, captivated by its haunting beauty. Vast ruins rising from a windswept plain, arches and domes standing like ribs of an ancient colossus. But back then, I had looked only with the eyes of an academic. This time, I traveled with the awareness that Ani might hold the final key to understanding the Watcher's awakening. I arrived at dawn. The sky was pale and windless. The broken walls cast long shadows across frost-covered ground. I walked slowly through the remnants of a city that had once thrived with life, markets, sanctuaries, libraries, now reduced to hollow shells. Crows perched on cracked archways. The air carried a stillness so profound it bordered on unnatural. As I moved deeper into the city, the world around me shifted in a way I cannot fully describe. It was as though the air thickened, as though each step carried me not just through space, but through the layered memory of centuries. My destination was a small, obscure chapel near the edge of the ruins, a structure almost invisible from a distance, overshadowed by grander buildings. But the elder monk had described it with precision, calling it the Stone of the Second Covenant. I found it half buried in sand, its doorway collapsed, its roof long gone. I had to crawl inside on hands and knees, brushing aside dust and debris. Within, the space was tiny, hardly more than a chamber. But the walls were covered in inscriptions, layer upon layer of carved symbols, written in languages that spanned millennia: Aramaic, Greek, Armenian, Georgian, Syriac, a script I could not identify, all circling around a central symbol carved deeply into the rear wall, the triangle beneath 7 strokes, the Watcher's mark. Below it, in half-erased Armenian, I could still make out fragments of a sentence: when the final blessing falls silent, this city will stand as witness that the covenant was known. My breath caught. This chapel was no ordinary sanctuary. It was a record, an archive of the covenant itself, a testament left by generations who sensed the fragility of the sacred word long before our era. I took out my notebook, trembling, and began copying the inscriptions. But as I reached the lowest line, I froze. The script there was more recent, only a few centuries old perhaps, and far less eroded. It read, "A voice will come in the final age to speak the word once more. If the longing endures in even one heart, the Watchers cannot claim dominion. But if the longing dies, the gates shall open and silence will reign." My blood ran cold. I whispered the old word under my breath. The air shifted, the dust stirred. And for a moment, just a brief, breath-stealing moment, I felt a presence move through the chamber, like a current of wind passing through a sealed room. A whisper brushed my ear. Not a sound, a sensation. "It weakens." I scrambled outside, heart pounding. The plain stretched before me, vast and empty. But at the edge of the horizon, something stirred, something tall, slender, indistinct. A silhouette, a watcher, not approaching, simply standing, observing. Their presence had grown bolder since the moment I spoke the word in my apartment. Their silence pressed harder, not as threat, but as inevitability. A slow encroachment, like a tide rising inch by inch over the sand. I stumbled backward from the chapel, breath ragged. The watcher's silhouette dissolved into the morning haze, but the impression remained, like a fingerprint on the fabric of the world. I spent hours wandering the ruins, searching for clarity, for a sign, for anything that might tell me what to do next. And it was in the remains of an ancient library, barely recognizable except for the faint traces of shelves carved into stone, that I found something extraordinary. Half buried beneath rubble lay a tablet carved from dark basalt. Unlike the others, its symbols were sharp, fresh, as though carved only decades ago, not centuries. The language was a composite of scripts I had seen in manuscripts across continents. The Watcher's Mark, surrounded by lines written in a proto-linguistic form that predated alphabets. But the center of the tablet contained a single sentence translated into multiple ancient languages. In Greek, the forgetting is the door. In Armenian, silence is permission. In Syriac, without longing, the word dies. And at the bottom, in a script that appeared hauntingly similar to the half-erased words spoken in biblical blessings, was another phrase. One voice delays the claim. I sat on the cold stone floor, my hands shaking. One voice, one longing, one memory. For the first time, the magnitude of what I carried hit me with full force. Not pride, not calling, a burden, a responsibility too enormous for a single man. But I also felt something else. They were afraid. The Watchers, those ancient beings who had hovered for millennia, waiting for humanity to forget the sacred breath, were not hostile. They were not malicious. They were not cruel. They were bound. Bound by a covenant that required absolute forgetting. Bound by silence. Bound by longing's extinction. As long as one human heart still carried the old word with its full, unbroken meaning, the Watchers could not cross the threshold. I was delaying them, not defeating them, not defying them, delaying. And delay, in their realm of cosmic timescales, meant disruption. Night fell over Annie as I sat amid the ruins, the sky turning a deep, ancient blue. The wind carried a chill that felt older than the stones around me. And far beyond the plain, I sensed the Watchers moving. Not closer, not distance made smaller by steps, but by awareness. More silhouettes, more stillness, more silent observation. As I stood to leave, a thought formed in my mind. Not fully mine, not fully theirs, something in between. The world is almost silent. Only your voice remains, and soon it too will grow tired. I gripped the last fragment of fading daylight and whispered the old word once more, not loudly, not bravely, but with every ounce of longing left in me. The wind rose sharply. Ruins trembled, shadows recoiled, and for the first time in my life, I heard the Watchers retreat, not defeated, not banished, but forced back by one whisper, one longing, one human refusal to surrender the word the world had forgotten. As I left Ani under the gathering darkness, one truth followed me like a shadow that no light could erase. The Watchers were not waiting anymore. They were coming, and I was the final strand delaying the silence. There is a heaviness that settles on a man when he realizes he is the last echo of something sacred. It is not pride, nor terror, nor even sorrow, though all three beat their wings inside the ribs like desperate birds. It is something quieter, heavier, older, a sense that the breath inside one's lungs is no longer merely personal, but the final ember of a fire that once warmed entire civilizations. As I began the final chapter of this journey, I understood fully and without illusion that the weight of the old word, its memory, its longing, its covenant, rested solely in me, not because I was chosen, not because I sought it, but because I had not yet surrendered, because the longing that had died in the world still lived, trembling but alive, in my chest. And the Watchers, they knew. After I left Ani, the sense of their presence did not fade. It intensified. At first in subtle ways, the unnatural stillness of empty streets, the sudden quieting of conversations when I entered a room, the eerie sensation that the world itself was holding its breath around me. But as the days passed, the subtlety vanished. I began to feel the watchers even in daylight, tall, faint silhouettes at the edges of my vision, bending like reeds, but never swaying in the wind. The air around them shimmered faintly, as though reality itself was thinner where they stood. They did not touch me. They did not speak, but they watched with a silence so profound it scraped at the inside of my skull. It was then I understood that the world had crossed into the threshold the texts had spoken of, the era when the forgetting reached completion. Humanity had not merely ceased to long for peace, it had become suspicious of it, afraid of it. Peace had become a word spoken only in slogans, a decorative term printed on posters, a shallow promise uttered without desire. Longing had died, and with it, the covenant, all but for one ember, one memory, one whisper that refused to extinguish itself. Me. I traveled next to a place I had avoided all my life, not because it held danger, but because it held a kind of truth so sharp it could not be approached without bleeding. I returned to my childhood home. It stood empty now, abandoned for years, its windows clouded, its roof sagging, its walls mottled with age. The garden where I used to play had become a miniature forest of weeds and brittle branches, but inside its decaying rooms, something remained, a memory of a time when the old word had still meant something in the world, when my mother whispered it over me before bed, when neighbors blessed one another with it, when the very air vibrated with a faint expectation that humanity might truly heal one day. I walked through the corridor where the wallpaper peeled like shedding skin, and I felt the watchers behind me, silent as falling ash. They did not enter the house, as though some boundary held them at bay. Perhaps it was the echo of past longing. Perhaps it was nothing more than respect for a threshold humans once considered sacred. I entered my childhood room and sat on the floor near the window. Dust drifted in the slanted afternoon light like suspended breath. The silence was thick, ancient, waiting. This was where I had first heard the old word. Not as an academic curiosity, not as a theological symbol, but as something tender, almost alive. My mother had whispered it when I cried. My father had spoken it with reverence when guests departed. The neighbors had sung it in holiday songs, not because tradition demanded it, but because they believed it, believed in what it represented. I closed my eyes and tried to summon the memory of their voices, the warmth of their longing. For a moment, I thought I could hear them, distant, indistinct, like music carried across a gulf of centuries. But then another sound intruded, a low hum, a vibration, a resonance that seemed to seep from the walls, the floor, the air. The watchers had drawn closer. They waited outside the house. Hundreds of them, perhaps. Silent, patient, unmoving, not to harm me, not to devour me, but to wait for me to grow quiet, for my longing to fade, for the ember inside me to extinguish itself naturally. That was their way. Not violence, not coercion. Just the inexorable weight of timeless silence pressing upon a mortal mind until the last breath of resistance surrendered. I stayed in that house for days, though time became increasingly difficult to measure. The sun rose and set without meaning. Food tasted like nothing. Sleep came in fractured bursts, filled with dreams of starless skies and gates of obsidian trembling under invisible pressure. The watchers remained outside, standing, witnessing, waiting, and inside me, the ember flickered. I whispered the old word again and again, but each time it felt thinner, weaker, as though my breath could no longer fully hold it. The world's forgetting pressed against me like an ocean against a glass sphere, seeking the hairline crack, and I felt myself cracking, not physically, spiritually. The longing that had sustained my journey began to dim, not through doubt, not through fear, but through exhaustion, a slow erosion of inner strength. And that was when the final sign came. On the fourth night, I awoke to find the house trembling, just slightly, like a creature stirring in its sleep. The air was cold enough that my breath rose in white swirls. The dust on the floor shifted in delicate spirals. The watchers had moved. For the first time, they approached the threshold of the house. Their silhouettes filled the windows like tall, slender monoliths. The glass did not break, but it bowed inward slightly, as though responding to their presence. And then, a sound, not external, internal. A pressure inside my skull, like a chorus of unspoken voices aligning into a single, towering thought. Your longing diminishes. Be silent. Let the world return to its rightful order. I pressed my hands to my ears, but the voices were not sound. They were resonance, meaning, silence shaped into command. I whispered the old word. A faint spark, a faint resistance. But the watchers pressed harder, their presence now overwhelming, filling the house like a rising tide of gravity. You cannot hold the word alone. No human can. My breath faltered. My whisper thinned. My resolve wavered. And then, just as my strength reached its end, I heard another sound. Not the watchers, not my own breath. A memory, a voice from decades ago, soft, warm, human. My mother's voice. She whispered the old word the way she had when I was a child. With tenderness, with conviction, with longing. It was not an illusion. It was not a hallucination. It was memory made present. Longing resurrected from the deepest recess of the soul. I felt something ignite inside me. Not hope, but something older. Inheritance. Continuity. The unbroken chain of human desire that reached back across millennia. I inhaled deeply, tears streaming down my face. And with every fragment of strength I had left, I spoke the old word. Not whispered, not murmured, spoken. Spoken as it was meant to be spoken. With longing, with memory, with defiance. The watchers recoiled. The windows cracked outward. The air snapped like lightning. A shockwave of meaning burst from my chest. A resonance not of sound, but of desire. The silhouettes outside staggered backward, bending violently as though caught in a powerful wind. Their forms flickered, blurred, dimmed. The ground trembled. The sky above the house rippled. And for one impossible moment, I saw the missing constellation, the stars faint but unmistakably present, reignite in the heavens like embers stirring back to life. The watchers froze. Then slowly, reluctantly, they withdrew. Their silhouettes dissolved into the darkness beyond the horizon, not defeated, not destroyed, but forced to retreat, bound once more by the covenant upheld by a single spoken longing. Silence fell. Not watcher silence, but human silence. Sacred, breath-filled, alive. I collapsed to the floor, trembling, sobbing, not from sorrow or joy, but from the sheer weight of what had passed through me. The house felt different, lighter, as though some ancient pressure had lifted. I stayed there until dawn. When the sun rose, the walls glowed with warm light. Dust floated gently, no longer swirling in unnatural spirals. The world felt grounded again, fragile but alive. The watchers were gone, for now, because the covenant had been renewed. Not fully, not permanently, but delayed, for another age, for another generation. As long as longing survives in even one human heart, the watchers cannot claim dominion. That is the law, the covenant, the ancient truth hidden beneath centuries of forgetting. I stood, weak but breathing deeply, and whispered the old word one final time. Not as plea, not as resistance, but as gratitude. Then I walked out of the house and into the morning. The world looked unchanged, but everything had changed. Because peace, true peace, had not been forgotten entirely. Because longing had survived. because silence had been resisted, and because one whisper had kept the sky from closing.